we're broadcasting from around the world for Monitor Night Live here on the campus of Principia College. The theme, 21 in 21. It should actually be 21 in 21 for 21, because this is the 21st airing of this fabulous series, Monitor Night Live, in which we feature reporters and editors from the world famous and Pulitzer Prize winning Christian Science Monitor newspaper based out of Boston, Massachusetts. Welcome everyone from all around the world. Before we go into it, let us give you a brief background of the history of Monitor Night Live here at Principia College.
Good evening. My name is George Moffett. I'm the president of Principia College, and it's my great pleasure to welcome you to this warm intellectual hearth on a cold winter evening. Tonight's event brings together two of my favorite institutions, Principia and the Christian Science Monitor.
The first Monitor Night Live was in 1997. That was the first year that Dr. George Moffett served as president of Principia College, and it is reflective of George as both a historian and a journalist.
The genesis of Monitor Night Live was probably a show on PBS television called Washington Week. This was a show, an hour-long show that aired on Friday night. Kind of the most respected journalists from the best newspapers and media outlets in the country, they would be gathered together with an incredible moderator to discuss those events. Occasionally, a Christian Science Monitor reporter would be invited to be part of that distinguished group. George always felt Christian Science Monitor reporters should be at the very top of the heap because of Mary Baker Eddy's tremendous vision for the Christian Science Monitor.
George had this sense that what print is doing and what the Monitor is doing, they're doing some of the most important activity on the planet. And he wanted it to reflect that importance, and he wanted it to reflect that excellence.
Early in his first year as president, which was 1996, he called and said he wanted to do Monitor Night Live, talked to me about the concept, and asked me to free up a number of members of the staff, which I did. So we agreed that we would provide Gail Chaddock, who was our chief congressional reporter, Peter Greer, sort of our senior Washington big scope writer, Jonathan Landay, our defense correspondent, and Marshall Ingerson, who was then Moscow correspondent and later became editor of the Monitor.
I was a Monitor White House reporter when I was on the panel. And, you know, the thing that I remember the most was not so much the event itself, but the rehearsals.
But what I would say to you about working with George on Monitor Night Live, he was a friend, he loved the Monitor. He was not easy on us, that we would go to for a long rehearsal with him, and then he would give us, as they say in the business, notes on what he would like improved.
George was so invested in it, and he'd come to the reporters and say, look, you guys, ratchet this up. Let's be really at the top level of the highest sense of journalism. What a great opportunity. Here you have all these students and opportunity to have them love their newspaper. Let's make this the very best it can be.
And so he held us there for, I think, a few hours in the second rehearsal, making us go over and over our points, and so that they were really tight and really good. And I'm so glad he did, because it made Monitor Night Live better.
To moderate, we're happy to welcome back David Cook. As many of you know, David's journalistic career peaked when, for 1 year, he served as editor of the Principia Pilot.
Thank you for that introduction, George. We'll be putting the George Moffett jokes back in our presentation, just to let you know. We are here because of what you, Prince students, mean to each of us as individuals, and what you mean for the newspaper we love.
There's been a long relationship between Principia and the Monitor. For the Monitor, it gave us an opportunity to connect in person once a year and to hear how students felt about the coverage we were providing and trying to recruit some of them to work at the Monitor.
Monitor Night Live over the past couple of decades has been valuable for the college because it has brought the first-hand experience of the editors and the correspondents of the Christian Science Monitor. And what's really fun is it's the personal connection of being able to interact with these men and women who are out there on the ground as events are happening. That is so absolutely fundamental to what this activity does for the college and for our students.
Our goal was to help students forge a closer connection with one of the most unselfish, outward-facing activities of the Christian Science Church.
I'm wondering what each of you consider the most rewarding part of your work at the Monitor. Thanks.
Being a reporter it's fundamentally about bearing witness to the good that is in others' lives and others' experiences and reflecting that back so that you and I as readers can see that good in the world. And there's such power in that. And I think my sense is George wanted to bring the clarity of that to Principia students, and that he wanted them to see how rewarding and fulfilling and adventurous a life at the Monitor would be.
I thought George was unparalleled in his ability to grasp and eloquently articulate Prin's mission and its potential in serving the cause of Christian Science.
I think George would be absolutely thrilled to know that Monitor Night Live has continued for 21 years. What a tremendous legacy, and just a perfect match between Principia and the Christian Science Monitor. I'm so incredibly grateful that it's continued.
I would just underscore that I thought the world of George. I thought he was an inspirational figure, a man of great character and class. And those of us at the Monitor, we loved him.
We are so grateful for George Moffett's insight in establishing Monitor Night Live and the years that it has helped serve the students of Principia College. We're grateful for everyone who has participated and for the staff of the Monitor for supporting it.
It's my pleasure to welcome you to the stage of Cox Auditorium on the Principia College campus.
We're grateful to have with us tonight John Yema, editor of the Christian Science Monitor.
This is the 16th installment.
Welcome everybody to the 18th Monitor Night Live.
We have with us the editor of the Christian Science Monitor, Mark Sappenfield.
And we're so grateful that you're here tonight to join us with the Monitor's Global Report 21 in 21.
The 21 in 21 project involved 12 reporters from around the world following 21-year-olds for 3 months, from Mexico to Afghanistan, France to Canada. It was conceived by Ryan Lenora Brown, our South Africa correspondent. She wanted to follow 21-year-olds because it's a time of coming of age, when individuals have their entire futures ahead of them, but are also likely to be profoundly shaped by what we're living through right now. The project itself was a massive endeavor. A normal story might involve a 1-hour interview. This was weeks and weeks of lengthy conversations, follow-ups, staying in touch via text message or social media.
I went about reporting my portion of the 21 in 21 project quite differently than I've ever reported a longer-term project before. I covered a young woman named Jimena, who is an artist and a student here in Mexico City. So I would have met up with her in person, I would have shadowed her, gone to classes with her, observed her with her friends. But because of the pandemic, interviews were almost exclusively video interviews. We would talk 1 to 2 hours every other week. And then about a week before I filed my last installment for the project, we were able to meet in person at her home, and I could see all of the artwork and see the space that she had been telling me about and showing me online for about 3 months in person. It had its challenges, but I think I really lucked out in that Jimena was open to really letting us have a window into her unique circumstances and life this year.
Throughout the duration of the reporting, I spoke with Jafar, a 21-year-old Boston University student who lives in Lowell, Massachusetts. Jafar dealt with 2 very important things at an early age. One was the loss of his eyesight due to a stray grenade from a passing U.S. soldier in a Humvee, and the other was immigrating from his birth country of Iraq to the U.S. as a refugee in the mid-2000s. I got a sense of just how unique those circumstances were for him, but also how the pandemic itself played a role in making all of these experiences come together. We really got a sense for how common and how unifying this worldwide event was, even if everyone's individual circumstances were different. This project inspired the theme of this year's Monitor Night Live, and we are excited to share with you this timely and very important report.
In this world of the pandemic and the isolation that many of us have due to government regulations or health regulations, best practices guidelines, even here at Principia College, we've learned to adapt to and use new technologies. Instead of running from meeting to meeting here on a campus, we Zoom about, and we even race to see who can get from one meeting to the next fast on Zoom. That's just one of the many things that impacts our lives in this new era. And that's part of what this evening will be about. I'm going to introduce Mark first, but we'll come to him last. Mark is the editor of the Christian Science Monitor. He's been reporting from Boston, the Bay Area, Pentagon, India. He's reported from Afghanistan and Pakistan. He has, I gather, also been our Mars correspondent, or at least he's reported for NASA and the Jet Propulsion Laboratory. He's covered 7 Olympic Games. Ann Scott Tyson, who is our Beijing bureau chief, but we have to do a wink wink because she's based right now in Seattle. And that is one of the reflections of the times right now of the struggle it is for Western reporters to get visas into China. And so I think she's just waiting for that visa so that she can do on the ground reporting. I first met Ann in 1993 when she was our bureau chief in Beijing, and she's back again. She has covered the Middle East. She's been in Afghanistan. Just a few more things of her background. She has written a couple of books, one, American Spartan, The Promise, the Mission, and the Betrayal of Special Forces Major Jim Gaunt. She's also written China Awakening, Life Stories from the Unofficial China. And we've talked a little bit, we've shared our own experiences of the unofficial China. Scott Peterson, who I got to meet last year and who tells me he hasn't traveled, has been to Iran 45 times. I don't know if we can count up all the times he's been to the other countries of the Middle East, whether it be Syria, Iraq, and the other nations. He did one of these prior Monitor Night Lives in the middle of night from Istanbul. He loves to rock climb. He loves to travel with his 4 children. And so this has been a tough couple of 9, 10, 12 months. But we've got him from London. And the person who we need to thank for this project, Ryan Lenora Brown, who is our African correspondent. She's based in Johannesburg, South Africa. She's been traveling across the continent to more than 24 of the countries. Her last foreign travel out of South Africa was to the non-country of Somaliland. I've just learned that you do need a visa for, but they have no embassies. So you literally have to go to Somaliland to get the visa, which in a way makes it one of the easiest countries to travel to. It was her inspiration that brought this project together. And I'm going to start with my first question for Ryan. What was going through your mind? This is an amazing project.
So, I was really interested in trying to think about this pandemic that we've all been living through on basically 2 scopes simultaneously. One is just the fact that this is something that has touched people everywhere in the world. I don't think I've personally lived through another event like this that so universally has warped the shape of life in every single place in the world, while also bringing it down to a really, really human scale and looking individually, granularly on the level of individual human beings. What does that look like? And the reason for looking at 21-year-olds in particular was I wanted to know what it was like for the world to stop at the moment your life was meant to begin. I wanted to know what it was like for this moment of incredible change, as a young adult, as a person coming of age, to happen just as a global crisis began to unfold. And 21 is a really interesting age because depending on who you are and where you are, it might be when you're starting your first job, it might be when you're finishing your education. In Israel, it's when you're finishing your mandatory military conscription. In South Africa, it's the average age that a woman has her first child. So there's all kinds of, all over the world, meaningful life events and life changes going on for people at that age. And then sort of, you know, on a more, on a broader scale, when historians, when scholars look at how generations are defined, they're very often defined by the big world events that happen when they are adolescents or young adults, you know? So for my generation, that would have been 9/11. For other generations, it might have been the Great Depression, World War II, Vietnam, Watergate, you know, these kind of events in the world that happen at the moment when you're deciding who you are and shaping your values and finding your place in the world really have an outsized impact on you for the rest of your life. And so we wanted to see, as journalists in real time, what does that look like for people who are coming of age now during this huge global event. So that's where it came from. And I wanted to do something that would harness the sort of global reach that the Christian Science Monitor has, and the fact that I have these incredibly talented colleagues all over the world who could connect with and do that kind of really empathetic human level reporting with young people all over the world.
You're muted, John.
Hey, there we go. There's the shortcoming of this. Thanks, Mark. Ryan, I'm going to come back to you, but I'm going to jump next to Scott. What's the essence of the story? Tell us about the story that you were capturing.
Well, the story that I worked on, I mean, I had the honor to speak to a young man who was a boxer. He dreamed of being a champion boxer. He was from Kabul, Afghanistan, 21 years old, of course, as all the others were. And the interesting thing here is that you've got somebody, as Ryan described, who is, I mean, their life was going to be a big year of change anyway, no matter what happened. And this pandemic just went to either change it, shift it, you know, somehow impact it. So, you know, his year started out actually trying to leave a very, very conservative family situation that was very bad. I mean, his family was poor. They did not support his obsession with boxing at all. And this was something that he, ever since the age of 7, was just supremely interested in, did very well, actually even was trying to become a member of the Afghan Olympic team, right? So he has got real potential. This isn't just some passing hobby, but his family were so uninterested, were so thinking that this was not to do with, you know, was un-Islamic. They said that you know, he should be busy looking for a job, you know, making money so that everybody could eat, could do well. And, you know, and ultimately he ended up leaving home to get away from that dynamic. And he had no idea what he was going toward. I mean, literally paid $200 in order for the first step, which, I mean, it was a very long journey for him because first of all, he had to get out of Afghanistan. So he's describing, you know, 10 days of driving just hot deserts across Western Afghanistan. Then he gets into Iran, makes it all the way to Tehran, which is a very long way from that border. And then, you know, carries on and then just has this incredible, you know, story and situation in Turkey, trying to cross the border where they get shot at. Some of their members are killed. I mean, there's so many layers of this where he is just stepping deeper and deeper and deeper into the unknown, trying to get to Europe, ultimately pushed back to Tehran. And that's when the pandemic hits. So his life already in flux, already lost. He thinks he's left his family, he's left his country. And of course, he's only 21, so he hasn't quite got all his bearings anyway. And now he's being picked up, put on a bus, and deported back to Afghanistan, back to this absolutely horrific family situation that literally, if he comes back from the gym late at night, his mother, they will shut him out of the house. He would have to go sleep with friends. He'd have to go sleep at the, you know, the kind of the place where he worked at a supermarket and would sleep with the guards. I mean, just so unwelcome. And so anyway, so then this story also charts how he has to cope with that completely different situation. He never would have been back in Afghanistan. He probably would have made it, but now he's back there.
How did you find him? How did you find the story?
Well, great question, and especially difficult to do by remote control, since of course we all have been working under those restrictions. I mean, not traveling at all. Fortunately, I have traveled to Afghanistan a lot of times, many times, going back to 1999. So the people that I'm working there with at the moment are people who I've known for years. These are, I mean, fixers, translators, that sort of thing. And so I've asked them to look for someone who is a suitable candidate. And they found several people. They literally had to find out, to make sure that they were 21 years old. They literally had to like look on their identity cards, because the actual subjects themselves weren't certain if they were 21. So they had to look at the dates and do the math to figure out how old they were. So you know, these people reported back to me and said, well, maybe this person, maybe that person, and are they willing to go through this 3-month journey with us, where we are doing these lengthy interviews, paying attention to everything that's going on. And ultimately, of course, in Kabul, you know, you know, parts of the story were just, even in Kabul, were very dramatic, because one of the final things, you know, one of the final events while you know, he's trying to cope with a very important boxing match, one that's going to get him onto the Olympic team or not. It turns out that there's then an attack very near his house on Kabul University by Islamic State militants. 35 students are killed in this event, and he hears the gunfire and literally runs toward the walls of the university. And you know, he and a friend basically can hear the screams of the students on the other side trying to get out. So they put ladders up on both sides of the wall, and he spends the next several hours, you know, rescuing at least 200 people over that wall. So nothing to do with boxing, nothing to do with the pandemic, and yet he's in that situation because of his dream of trying to get to Europe, being forced back, and then how the pandemic again lays its restrictions on his life.
Mm-hmm. And I'm going to flip over to you, because I think you and the subject of your story are such a curiosity, because you're the bureau chief for Beijing, based in the United States. You're interviewing a subject in Shanghai who goes to school in the United States remotely. What's the essence of that story?
Yeah, well, Lucy's story is more tranquil in many ways than the story of the boxer who Scott was speaking with. I would say it has two levels. On one level, there's the strategic, and Lucy was very much caught up in the crosswinds of all of the conflict between the US and China. She was studying at Northeastern University, getting her finance degree, loves Boston, loves the United States. And this is at a time of incredible tension. And when the pandemic strikes, her main question is, if I leave here and she's, you know, she only has 1 year to go, am I ever going to be able to get back? Visas for Chinese students were being canceled here at an incredibly high number, and there were all sorts of suspicions being cast on the motives of students and so forth. But there were factors partially to do with the you know, just sort of her sense of being overwhelmed as the pandemic struck and she was isolated, and her parents were very much wanting her to return home, as many Chinese students did from around the world. So she did return home, and then how the pandemic ended up playing out in each country. So, I mean, it's still playing out, but in the first year, also had very important implications, because China, after draconian lockdowns, did end up coming out of it much more quickly and getting its economy going and its society opening up much more quickly. And so Lucy and her experience could see and compare and contrast the United States and China in that light, and her whole generation could see and compare and contrast that, which I think really does shape their attitudes in many ways, given that the generation is already quite patriotic. They have unquestioning faith in their government, and despite the fact that there was early anger voiced in China over the delays in reporting the pandemic, they ultimately were quite successful with their tactics. So that's sort of the strategic story that Lucy was caught up in the middle of. And then there was a much more intimate story. At the most intimate level, it was the story of Lucy and her cat, Cotton, a cat she adopted from a shelter in Boston and was extremely attached to. I mean, Cotton was her friend. Cotton was her companion. And she had other friends, of course, in non-pandemic days, but during the lockdown, they were sort of isolated together, and the cat to her was a personality and very, very much like a person. So as she was trying to make this difficult decision about her future and whether she could ever get back to the United States if she left, she also had to consider the fate of Cotton and the difficulty of getting her cat back with her to China. The odyssey of this journey with her cat is something that I won't relate in great detail, but suffice it to say, it involved months of health forms, trying to get tickets for her cat on an airline. Many Chinese students were trying to get pet tickets to return to China, and flights were quite restricted at that time, only to arrive back in China and to be quarantined with her cat. But she made it back, and then this became a story of her really reconnecting with her family, introducing them to Cotton because she really wanted them to know her and know how important the cat was to her life. But beyond that, it was about connecting in a special way with her family and her parents that she would not otherwise have had a chance to do. And in the midst of all of that, she's a very talented, very driven young woman who had a lot of frustration about not being able to advance along her trajectory as quickly as she has hoped. But I'll leave it at that.
Okay, we may come back to that. Ryan, the person you interviewed and got to know was so different. Their story was so different than these. Tell us about that.
So I spent the last 3 months of 2020 following a young woman who was pregnant with her first child. And as I mentioned before, 21 is the average age in South Africa at which a woman has her first child. So I was looking, when I went out to find a 21-year-old, I was looking for somebody who was having that experience, in part because it represented something sort of average about South African society, and in part because I thought it was a particularly profound and striking example of, the ways in which the world has stopped at the moment that all these 21-year-olds' lives are meant to begin. So here was sort of the biggest thing that will ever happen in this woman's life about to happen, and all around her, the world had kind of ground to a halt. And I was just very interested in what that looked like. So the woman I followed, Cindy, she lives in Soweto, which is a township outside of Johannesburg. Townships are the sort of bedroom communities that were created for Black South Africans during apartheid so that they would be able to work in the white cities nearby but live in segregated communities. And a lot of Black South Africans still live there. And she lives in a single room behind somebody's house, like a freestanding room with an outdoor toilet that she shares with her aunt and her young cousin. And it was and is trying to become the first person in her family to go to university. So had a whole lot of different threads to her story, a lot of things going on, sort of represented for me this kind of fierce, scrappy desire that a lot of young South Africans have to overcome the circumstances that they were born into and to realize the kind of unrealized promises of democracy in South Africa. And she was just a really smart, fun, articulate, thoughtful, interesting person to talk to. You know, I think everybody on this panel who's a journalist knows that sometimes you just strike gold with people. A lot of people, most of us in the world, are not very good at reflecting on our own experiences and making meaning of them. And then you get the occasional person who just is, you know, and it really makes a huge difference in the kinds of stories you're able to tell about them. And so I felt Cindy was one of those kinds of people.
Wow. I want to ask a question of you as sort of the one who's had the idea and brought this together. Did you see any themes developing across the 12 stories?
Yeah, interestingly, we did. And, you know, I have to say I was a bit surprised by that because I came in thinking, you know, a pandemic is going to be experienced completely differently by a middle-class college student in the US versus, you know, a guy in Afghanistan trying to get to Europe versus, you know, a working-class young woman in South Africa or in India. I thought there's just sort of a chasm between those experiences in normal life, and I'm sure the pandemic has only widened it. You know, and in some ways that's true. We know that this pandemic kind of pushed apart existing inequalities and, you know, sort of made that divide even larger. We're seeing that in the way that sort of vaccine access is playing out now. But I was also struck by the sort of common threads and similarities among all of these very, very different young people. And one interesting one to me was the way that technology became both this kind of lifeline for people, this connection to the outside world at a very isolating time, but also something that they got really exhausted of, you know. And this is obviously a generation of really digital natives who have, you know, had tech at their fingertips their whole lives. And I thought if anybody, you know, would sort of weather this pandemic without getting exhausted by them, it would be them. But they all found it, you know, as tiring as any of us. And you know, and had this kind of really profound craving for human contact and face-to-face interactions. You know, and then these kind of tensions between being young and the sort of recklessness of being young and wanting to take risks and wanting to take leaps forward in your life and the kind of caution that's demanded by a pandemic. People saw that everywhere in the world, you know, and either maybe not necessarily feeling like they had to protect themselves, but they had to protect other more vulnerable people in their lives. And how did they sort of wrestle with that and reckon with that? And, you know, and then just the sort of feeling of being caught between two lives, you know, like so many of us, you know, the life they had before the pandemic and this future that they imagined for themselves that kind of seemed like a speck on the horizon that wasn't getting any closer all of a sudden. So I think we saw those kind of themes all over the world, wherever people were and whatever they were doing.
Scott, did you get that sense? Has Ryan picked up on that theme?
Oh yeah, absolutely. The you know, this boxer's story, of course, you know, everyone has this dynamic that they're, you know, that they're living in, his expectations of what that year was going to bring for him. I mean, it just, not only did it not pan out, but then he ended up also just trying to, as a, you know, as any good athlete, just trying to kind of bounce back, rebound, and reevaluate, you know, what his life was going to be like and where it was going to start from, because he had one idea as, you know, as the year began. But, you know, it's interesting because the way that we found him, we did of course find him, and he doesn't speak English. So I always had to work with my translator to do interviews. But what we did, I mean, it was a combination of all sorts of things. I mean, it, you know, is, of course, he doesn't have a computer, and often his own, you know, but everyone has a, you know, has a smartphone in Afghanistan. And so that was the primary tool. Of course, he lives in Kabul so that my translators could get to him. And during our first interview or two, we actually did, I mean, we used specific, kind of SIM cards that would go into the phones that would give us a higher bandwidth, just long enough so that I could actually do and conduct a video conversation with him so I could see the context in which he was sitting. So, of course, I mean, really a very, very poor family. And it's the kind of household that I had seen countless times in Afghanistan. I mean, just very, very simple. I mean, his own bedroom, literally is just a carpet. He has a cushion, and then up on the wall, literally taped with Scotch tape, are his 6 medals, which were his path to what he hopes is going to be the Olympic team. I mean, he is really very, very good and very, very strong, and against all the odds, has actually been now sponsored by, of all things, the team, the higher education ministries team of boxers, which sounds pretty unlikely, but that is the path to success in Afghanistan. But it's coming from such a humble place. And in order to get to that, we really did have to kind of work through it. But at the same time, these are the kind of stories, and this is one of the things that I think that this story helped to, kind of magnify. This is an example of what's happening all over Afghanistan as well. Obviously not just to 21-year-olds, but I mean, we have the backdrop of 40 years of war. Everybody is coping with that. In recent months, especially, we've had now a targeted assassination campaign. There's been a lot more violence, specifically in Kabul, which has made, which has obviously complicated everybody's lives. You have American troops who've been there since 2001, now down to just 2,500, and potentially many more coming out. You've got the Taliban encroaching around. So there was this dramatic backdrop to this 21-year-old story but in that sense too, there were some very universal things that that he was having to grapple with, and that was just that future, exactly as Ryan described. That speck on the horizon that just now, I mean, for him, almost he just saw it kind of drop off the backside and lost sight of it for a long time, and just had to recalibrate and redefine it.
Ann, I'm glad you popped back in. Lucy, though, I gather she's tenacious in a different way. I mean, she's not the boxer in that physicality, but she's very committed, as I can tell, to her education, and that's her path.
Yes, very much so. During the time I was interviewing her, she was taking the GRE. She's preparing to apply to graduate school. And she was constantly sort of thinking about her peers who had graduated a little earlier and how far ahead they were. And she had this, she had to study it late at night, her time. So she had to wake up, and her mother would prepare Chinese snacks for her, typical dishes. And at one point she was signed up for the GRE, but because of a glitch in the time that it said, a difference in the time zone, she missed it, and she was horribly frustrated, but she immediately signed up again. And meanwhile, she was doing tutoring sessions. She has another set of tutors / advisors who are helping her with her graduate school applications. And she was also frustrated because one of the great features of her program in Boston was the opportunity to do internships, in-person internships. And she had one at a Boston bank that she really loved, but those opportunities were not available, or if they were available, she wasn't landing them. So she later, when they became more available, she did some interviews, but again, over Zoom, she would face these technical glitches like I just did, being cut off, or, the first 10 minutes, she couldn't really communicate with them. And so she wasn't given the opportunities. And there were a lot of frustrations built into it. At the same time, I should explain that in terms of the pandemic itself, other than the fact that she was not able to be in the United States and achieve the goals that way. Her day-to-day life, and she wasn't isolated in the sense because she was actually in Beijing for most of the time, living with her mother. And she could go out, she could go stroll in the streets, go to restaurants, hang out with her high school friends. During the New Year, they had a plan to all get together. So things had opened up very, very much. And there was a tremendous contrast, other than the occasional, again, draconian, but limited in scope lockdown whenever they would have a small outbreak. She was quite free to live a normal life and socialize with friends and that sort of thing. But she was frustrated in advancing her goals.
Mm-hmm.
She also felt, just a small aside, but she also felt as though she was at somewhat of a disadvantage with her online classes because she didn't feel as confident, and she didn't feel that the teachers were necessarily calling on her. That sort of thing was frustrating too.
Got it. Now, Ryan, in our conversations earlier about South Africa, how has the pandemic affected the life, particularly for a new mother?
Yeah, I mean, what's interesting about reporting on South Africa generally, what I love about living here and reporting here is that I think South Africa is the most unequal country in the world, and in that fact is a kind of microcosm of the world. You kind of see all of the issues that play out in the world more broadly around questions of diversity and inclusion and the gap between the rich and the poor, just in a sort of more extreme version here than almost anywhere else. And so I think that was true in the pandemic as well. I saw for myself the divide between people like me and people like Cindy just growing wider in this time. People like me for whom life could kind of somewhat easily migrate online. Obviously, with the job I have, it's a big disappointment to not be able to travel and meet people and see people, but I can continue to work. I have access to the internet, all of that. So there was sort of the me's on one side, and on the other side, people like Cindy for whom every single person in her life who had a job lost their job, basically. Social distancing was not really possible in the kind of close quarters where they lived. It was just a completely different experience of the pandemic. And for her in particular, she had the experience of relying on what is already sort of a quite creaky, overburdened public health system at a time when it was further overburdened by a pandemic. But she obviously needed to access it, in terms of medical care. But I think she now has about a 1-month-old, and from talking to her since she's given birth, yeah, it really came down to the wire between a monitor deadline and the birth of this baby. It was a sort of touch and go there for a minute if we were going to have a baby's birth in our story or not. But anyway, luckily we did. But she has about a 1-month-old now, and and I think from what she said to me, I think she's finding that it is now giving her sort of purpose and a sense of the future in this year that last year lacked, or that was sort of nebulous and difficult to grasp last year. Now she has the future literally in her hands, in front of her, and she sees something and someone changing every day and growing every day. And I think it's made a huge difference to sort of her experience of the pandemic.
Right. I'm going to switch this a little bit and ask you, how did you pitch this idea of reaching into these individual lives to your colleagues?
One of the great joys of working at the Christian Science Monitor is I think we're all seeking stories that are different than the stories we're reading in other publications on the one hand, and also stories that are sort of deeply intimate and human and, drill down at what people's experiences are like at that level. So it wasn't a very hard sell. It wasn't, I can say with great gratitude, it wasn't a very hard sell to my editors, and it wasn't a very hard sell generally to my colleagues. And I think, I don't want to speak for them and I'll let them speak for themselves, but I think, in this year that has been so isolating as well, the prospect of spending a lot of time with someone, for me personally was sort of profound on both a professional level and a personal level, because I've just gotten to know so few people in this year, whether in my personal life or for reporting, and so the prospect, I think, of spending a lot of time with somebody was a fun and interesting one for all of us at the end of 2020.
Scott, was it an easy pitch for you?
Absolutely. Absolutely. I mean, partly because it really was, I mean, we really have been kind of starved of the intimacy that reporting normally provides to us, because we're not out there speaking normally directly with our sources now during this pandemic and everything else. So even though it's certainly in my case, this was done remotely. So I have yet to meet my boxer, who I certainly will meet as soon as I get back to Kabul, believe me. But he, it really was, I think, the kind of story that speaks absolutely to the Monitor values that we aspire to achieve. And that really is looking at that, human spirit and condition, and trying to illuminate how people are coping, and give examples of that kind of resilience and that sort of thing. Interestingly enough, my boxer, Zabihullah, has also, in the process of redefining like what his year is going to be like, is similar to Ryan's, in her Cindy, who has given birth, and now that has provided a new structure and framework. So of course, the boxer is still wrestling with his family. Some days are better than others and some days aren't. But of course, as he gets better, and the very fact that his last few months have gone through this, this kind of frequent conversations with me and with my translator, has actually improved his situation, because it's basically raised the profile of their son to a point where they have themselves, the rest of the family, reevaluated the value of what he is actually doing. So in that sense, it's kind of indirectly helped his case. But for himself, he has redefined what he wants to do, and now is finding a way in Kabul to do it, because he has no choice. And that was something that he couldn't have imagined before. And now things are falling into place, because he sees a path with his boxing. He's studying at a medical technical university and working at a supermarket to pay the way for that. And it's all still tentative and tricky, but at least he has a path that he's leaning toward. But I think in terms of like selling this, I mean, let's be honest. I think in our after action report that we put together, that everyone was crowded around on a Zoom call and we were talking about it. And I think probably, volume of time per word with what was actually produced in terms of, the amount of work, the interviews that we did, the amount of detail that was required, and then how it all filtered into Ryan's primary big piece, and then into these separate 12 pieces. I mean, it works. It's extraordinary. And it is, I think, a very good reflection of what it was originally envisioned to be. But it was also a lot of work. And hopefully that comes through, because you don't get that kind of detail. You don't get those, you don't get that gold dust without leaving behind a lot of ore behind that just is useless. And not useless, but just, it all fed into what was, finally produced, but very, I think, Monitor-esque. And I am certain that Mark is going to speak about that when the time comes.
And I'm going to actually flip the question a little bit. How did you sell the story to a source, to Lucy?
Oh, to Lucy. It really wasn't very hard, in that I was in an unusual situation in that, being outside of China, with a lot of potential political sensitivities and so forth. I already had a goal for this period of time to to interview more people inside of China about all the different stories that I was writing. And so this was one of the first times that, okay, I sort of executed that. And I went through another just person I knew, and to help me identify a few people. Then I interviewed a few of them, and a couple of them actually weren't 21. They ended up being 22, so they got ruled out. Then Lucy was just amenable from the get-go. She didn't have any reservations. And the other aspect of it was that the goal was to get to know all about this person's life in as much detail as possible. I didn't seek her out as someone who was particularly extraordinary or even representative. I just sought her out to get to know her and find out what was going on in her life. And as a reporter, I've always felt that every single person you encounter has a story to tell. There's some poignancy, there's some special meaning to that. And I knew that would come out. And again, I wasn't trying to find anyone with just this incredibly dramatic story. So she was quite happy to spend time with me. And it is an unusual experience as a reporter to get the luxury of this amount of time, of this many interviews, of getting to know their lives in this level of detail. And in a way, we became sort of friends. I ended up helping edit some of her essays to apply to graduate school, which is something I wouldn't have had to have done. But I just thought it would be sort of the a nice thing that I could offer her after she gave me so much of her time. So yeah, it worked out really well.
Ryan, your editor at the paper, Clara Germani, right, would help put this all together. And for the audience, Clara has just this past year left Principia, where she has been on the staff of the Monitor, had come to Principia with her husband, Marshall Ingerson, and had served as one of our journalism professors. And so I'm glad she's back in the craft and helping. And I just want to acknowledge that. But I understand that the big mucky muck editor of the Monitor didn't really know the nature and context and breadth of the story until he picked it up and read it. Is that true?
Is that for me or for Ryan?
Well, does Ryan know that? Because I presume it's true because you told me it. So Mark, step on in. How did you respond?
I'm sorry?
How did you respond to this baby that Ryan has delivered?
I think what was amazing to me about it was, and I love what Scott said earlier, and both Scott and Ryan about, craving humanity at this time. Because I think one of the things that hasn't been said so far today is that when Ryan conceived of this, she really thought about it in a different way too. I think what the point that you're getting to, John, is that there's this kind of form of that those who have read the series saw, which is called an as told to, which is kind of something that's new in journalism. It's something that's just beginning. And it's interesting how at a time when we're thirsting for so much human connection, that the desire of the kind of this thing that Ryan put into action was about delivering people's voices kind of unfiltered. If you read these as told to, these 12 stories, and Ann and Scott and Ryan have been talking about the different stories they told, the whole idea was to get them out of the picture. So often in journalism today, we get things through the lens of the journalist, we get things through the filter of the journalist. But I think what was so extraordinary about this was that Ryan came up with this idea that allowed us to really sit in the living room with these 12 people and have that human contact in this kind of unfiltered way that I'm just not sure I'd ever seen in the Monitor before. And at the point that we were talking about earlier, John, that you're referencing, is that the Monitor has kind of made its name through adding context, through adding analysis, and kind of putting all this surround around the stories. And when I first read the stories, and as you mentioned, I was not a part of editing the series. That was Clara's job. So in a lot of ways, I was reading the stories as they came out, you know, just like any reader would. And one of the things that struck me about it was that this was a very different kind of Monitor story. You know, it very intentionally was not about trying to find those connections. And as Ryan said, there were things that draw it together, but it was really just to see 12 people. And here were 12 people doing very ordinary things, but in the context of an extraordinary moment. And I think what struck me is that once I kind of had to tune myself into, this is not kind of the typical way that I read a Monitor story, but once I kind of tune myself into that, there's just such, as Scott said, such richness about the experience you can have with these people that was really touching.
Ryan, how do you respond?
Well, I'm always glad to hear my boss likes what I produce. That's good to know. And yeah, I mean, Mark has sort of put my thoughts about what I was hoping to do with this series like into more articulate words than I could have. But I think the sort of remarkable thing about that story format is it is in a sense very filtered. The journalists who worked on it will tell you it takes a lot of work to tell a story in somebody's voice like that. But the effect is that it's sort of very raw and intimate, and it is as if you are hearing directly from the person, face to face. And I think that was a kind of reporting on the pandemic that I hadn't seen a huge amount of before, and was, I thought, a place that the Monitor, with its sort of interest in news with heart, could step in and do something quite unique. And just to sort of underline what you were saying earlier about Clara, I think that this series could not have come to life without an incredibly talented, smart, and very empathetic and sensitive editor to kind of guide all of those pieces to life. And anybody who knows Clara knows, which I know a lot of you at Principia do, knows that she is all those things and really was the sort of backbone of this whole series. So I also just want to acknowledge her and the work she did.
Sure. I'm going to, at this point, invite those that have questions to be popping them into the Q&A. And I see there's one there. I'm always happy if either Tara Adhikari or Sophie Hills, two of our undergraduates at the college, both who work on the college newspaper, who worked with Clara last year and the year before, and currently work with Allison Terry, who I want to thank for helping put this year's Monitor Night Live together. She was on the staff of the Monitor before coming to Principia, and was one of the pioneers of infographics, I understand, with the Monitor. But Sophie or Tara, do you want to introduce one of the questions?
Yes, I would be happy to, President Williams. So in the intro video, we heard that this series required more in-depth interviews carried out over many weeks. Did the way this story was reported change the way you'll report in the future, or the kinds of stories you'll want to pursue?
And
I think, for me, it underscored something I think I had always known about journalism, but that you can kind of forget in the day-to-day reporting of stories, which Ann also mentioned, which is that everybody, if you spend enough time with them, has a really profoundly interesting story. It doesn't matter how mundane the sort of details of their day-to-day life, and of course, the details of a lot of our lives in the last year have been extraordinarily mundane. It doesn't matter, about that. If you can get to know somebody, there's always a story to tell. And so I think this was just a really, really good reminder of that, that sort of many of the best interviews we do as journalists come from the times not when we ask kind of amazing, pointed, sharp questions of people, but when we just are able to kind of like take our time and sit back and listen and, let people's lives and experiences kind of unspool in front of us. It creates, I think, a really profound kind of storytelling and a really interesting kind of journalism.
I think it's also a good reminder of the utility of kind of going back and following a source for a long period of time. I mean, we do that, we dip into people's lives usually, and often that's the last time we're there. But this really showed us the kind of power of a narrative that can continue. So, I mean, we've done projects, I mean, different kinds of projects. I mean, the one that's popping into my mind right now is one that I wrote from Iraq, of an Iraqi family, and I wrote 20 stories about them during 12 years of that war. And so even though I wasn't following every single move in their lives, there was a continuum in the sense that our readers would get to know. And in the mundane details of their lives was some extraordinary kind of illumination into what it was like to live in Iraq during the war, face to face with that conflict, when you had none of the tools or any of the other things that, you know, that we as correspondents, or, you know, certainly as American troops or Iraqi troops or anyone else, you know, had to cope with that. And I think it just, you know, this, when you see the sum total of this series, and really just to see the landing page on the monitor that has the 12 different pictures, and these people could not be more different, and they really are, and their lives are so extraordinarily different. But the fact that every single one of them has a narrative thread that we, you know, that the correspondent followed in, you know, for those months, I think really lends a depth, and that's something that I think, you know, we should be doing more of. It's very labor intensive, but the results really do get at what we're trying to do.
Ann, you want to add anything?
Oh, well, I would just add that on the as told to, that it was fun to attempt that, and, you know, to grow with a new type of storytelling, a new type of highlighting the person's voice. And I would simply say that we normally summarize people's lives and bring out those particularly moving or powerful quotes, but voice is also very important, and I think that that's a sort of a different level of bringing someone's, you know, bringing someone living and breathing onto the pages. And I think it would be good to add that to our toolbox as we approach the news, and consider it as one way to tell a certain kind of story that might particularly lend itself to that.
Mark, it makes me think of a Frederick Weissman documentary almost, in the sense that you go in and attempt to record as much as possible as opposed to interpret.
Yeah, no, I think Ann said it perfectly, is that it took an extraordinary amount of work from the people on this call and others not on this call to do what they did. And I think the legacy that they leave behind is not only the journalism, but this form of journalism that they are helping to pioneer. That we were talking earlier that there's a very well-known journalism award called the Polk Award that has created a new class of award for this kind of journalism, and it's called oral history. And that's exactly right. As Ryan says, it's really hard to do, but really what you're trying to do is try and give the best sense of, I'm in a room and I turn on the recorder and then I step back and I let you listen. And there's so much more involved in it than that. In some ways, it's harder to do than a normal form of story. I guess in a lot of ways, it's harder to do. But I just agree with Ann. She said it so perfectly. It's a new tool in our toolbox, and this group has brought that to us.
Sophie, the next question.
The next one is, several people have wondered this. Have you had any continued contact with the 21-year-olds you interviewed? And do you plan on writing a follow-up series? Someone suggested 31 and 31.
Oh, I've already pitched 22 and 22 for 22. But yeah, Scott, Ann, Ryan.
So I was just in indirect contact with my boxer just yesterday. And let's see, it is 2:40 in the morning here in London, which puts it at about, that makes it, let's see, 7:10 in the morning in Kabul right now. So in a few hours after Friday prayers, my translator is going to actually go over and see Zabiullah and have a long discussion with their neighbors, because earlier this week, there was a dispute that ended up with Zabiullah ending up in a police cell overnight in this dispute with his neighbors. And it was just a miscommunication between, like, I mean, he shouldn't have been there. And my translator actually was able to spring him out in a second, because of course he knew someone in the police department, but he's going to clear it up with all the neighbors today. So this is the latest kind of iteration of this. Couldn't have predicted, wouldn't have had any idea. I'm sure it's going to be fine. But anyway, so that's the latest. Is it going to yield a follow-up story? I expect when he is a very serious member of the Afghan Olympic boxing team, that will at least warrant a story. But I think when I get back to actually see him in real life, then that easily could do it too, because then I also will have that much more granularity, because I'll be able to, just see him really face to face.
I've had some contact with Lucy on and off, including surrounding this event and her getting the copy, get the copy of the magazine that was mailed to her. And as I said, just being an assistant with her, being an assistant on some of her graduate school applications. And I certainly do hope to maintain contact, especially if she ends up she does want to go to graduate school in the United States. And so that would also give us an opportunity to meet in person. And her boyfriend is actually in Seattle. I have not met him, but he's actually weathering the pandemic here.
Ryan.
Yeah, well, like I said before, so Cindy has a month-old baby now, and so it's just sort of deep in that phase of early motherhood and having a baby and just keeping another human alive, So from what I've been able to gather from her, that is taking up the vast majority of her time at this moment.
Okay, Tara, next question.
Have you received any reactions from the 12 interviewed on the finished stories, their impressions of how their stories were told?
Very positive.
I have not gotten direct feedback from Lucy about what she thought about the story, but it's possible. Again, the copy of the magazine was mailed to her, so I'm not sure. We had a little bit of back and forth. She said, I definitely don't want to miss it. And there is the Great Firewall of China. I'm not positive about her access to online, but in any case, no, I haven't gotten any direct feedback.
Scott, you were saying something.
Yeah, so Zabiullah, when his family saw the story and also the fantastic photographs, because I have to say, I mean, one thing we're talking to writers here for this series, but the photography department under Alfredo Souza did a fantastic job hiring good freelance photographers, in every one of these locations. So they're beautiful pictures, and the one that photographed the boxer in Kabul photographed him in his kind of basement gym, and it was just really an atmospheric sense about what it is like to be there. So when his family saw these, and it gave him, I think it gave him a pass for a few more days, and again caused them to rethink. We certainly heard, I mean, in that sense, I've heard fairly positive things back about it, and of course the translation. My translator has of course had to translate it to him, but he knows the story. So, but the pictures I think really spoke to him.
Ryan, have you heard anything from?
The sense I get from Cindy is that she just found it quite cool to be plugged in with all of these other 21-year-olds around the world to kind of have her story put in conversation with other people. As I say, it's been a very isolating time for her, like for all of us, and to just see how other people in her situation were living, I think was really cool for her. She's actually going to be on the panel discussion that Tara and Sophie are leading. I was going to say today, but today my time, tomorrow your guys' time. Yeah, so she's really excited to know more about all the other 21-year-olds and sort of even learn more about their experiences too.
Sophie, a question.
Yes. So another question, as American journalists, and obviously a bit spread across the world, how much do you have to deal with government interference, curiosity, or censure?
You want to
Sorry,
start?
I didn't exactly, it said government interference or government interference, curiosity or censorship?
Yes.
Well, I would simply say that American journalists in China, because I have been in China within the last few years, face a lot of difficulties, a lot of challenges, given the level of surveillance that they're under constantly, and some fairly harsh working circumstances that exist there, especially depending on where you are in China, and what you're working on. So yes, and I mean, yeah, I won't elaborate beyond that.
Actually, I think one of the ways that governments are very good at controlling things is just by preventing you from going there. So it's incredibly difficult to get visas sometimes. I mean, as John mentioned earlier, I've been to Iran 45 times. I haven't had a visa for the last 2 years. And that's not necessarily meaning because it's anything that I've written, but it's every single one of those 45 visas was a battle. None of those were just gifted. And, it's also getting a visa for Afghanistan, getting a visa for Iraq. And, in one place that I have not been able to get to for several years has been Yemen, which has been incredibly challenging. And that's not because Yemeni authorities won't allow that to happen, but it's actually primarily been because of Saudi control over flights and over the UN decision-making process about who's able to fly and not. And they allow NGOs to fly in, and they don't allow journalists or any other observers. So it's become incredibly challenging and dangerous. So it's not like you're submitting your story to a censor, but it is a different way of kind of controlling our access to things, because obviously it's just all the more challenging if you can't physically get there.
Ryan, have you bumped up against governments like that recently?
Not recently, since recently I've only been in South Africa, which is a sort of dream of a place to report from in that regard. But yeah, in prior lives, there's in many of the same ways as Scott, the sort of obstacles I've faced tend to be around getting visas or getting media permissions to do things. So some of the countries I've run into it in recent years are South Sudan, Rwanda, Tanzania, places that have a sort of vested interest in making sure people don't see what's actually happening on the ground. One of the disappointments about not being able to travel during the pandemic is not being able to have access to those kinds of places where there are stories that need to be told, and it's really, really hard for local journalists to tell them because it's really dangerous. And foreign journalists just aren't able to get in at the moment. And, there's an intersection, I think, in a lot of repressive governments all over the world between using public health as a pretext, we need to close the borders for safety, we need to restrict gatherings for safety, and also the effect it can have that is also on purpose of restricting media freedom and restricting people's ability to gather for protests and demonstrations and letting people elsewhere in the world know what's going on in their country.
Mm-hmm. All right, you have the next question.
Yes, I do. How does the monitor maintain its neutrality with regard to politics in the US and the world?
Mark, you want to start on that one?
Sure. I think it's, I mean, the obvious answer is that it begins with just being fact-based. Obviously, during that time, you know, you could have I had a conversation with a Principia class earlier today, and you know, literally that topic could take an entire hour all by itself. But just in the format today, I have to leave it at that. But I would say it also, I would say even, you know, even more in the sense it's in the heart of the staff. In the sense, I was talking to a member of staff the other day, and we were just talking about this, and he was kind of like, well, you have to live it, don't you? And I kind of wanted to, you know, take it and frame it and put it in gold leaf and put it on the wall. It's like, if that's in your heart, then you'll do it. If it's not in your heart, then it's going to be a struggle. And I think the point is that if it's in your heart, then you're going to fight for it. And we are at a moment in the United States where I think by any measurable, any way you could look at it, we are kind of as divided in terms of politically as we have been in any of our lifetimes. So it does require a struggle, because the mental atmosphere in the United States is very much pulling us apart from one another. And so if you don't want to give in to that, you have to fight to get to that place where we can see each other as human beings. And I just think, to kind of bring it full circle back to this event, is what a beautiful demonstration of this is, of fighting to see people's humanity. And if we can do that for everyone, you know, that's how the monitor fights to be fair and be unbiased.
I'm going to jump ahead to see what other questions there are. Sophie.
So this is a question for everyone. What do you think the long-term impact of the pandemic on the current young generation will be?
Ryan, I'll let you start.
I asked a number of sort of historians and other academics this, and it really made them squirm, because all of them basically said, you can't know, you have to see, you know, how these things kind of unfold, and often the effects of things like this are surprising. You know, one thing somebody pointed out to me is sometimes really profound global events like this that kind of open questions about, you know, inequality, for instance, can go in one of two directions in terms of whether they propel people to be more politically active and more engaged, or to kind of give up on the system and opt out of it, you know. And so when you have these kind of things that really press hard on the society, on people's lives and values, it can sort of go a number of ways. So I think we will, as many of our readers and people here have suggested, have to follow up in 2022 and 2031 and all of that, and see what happens.
Ann, do you have any sense from?
Sorry, not specifically from, well, Lucy, being a supply chain major, she was really looking into the impact of the interdependence of the supply chains and how to manage the risks of that for companies going forward. It's one interesting statistic is apparently about half of all young Chinese of Lucy's generation, which is the generation in their 20s now, born between about 1990 and 1999, are going into business. So that's a pretty high percentage. She's very, very business oriented and very technology oriented as a result of that. And I think that some of the biggest impacts are going to be in the new technologies, or the existing technologies that have been proliferated as a result of the pandemic, and that will shape what this generation ends up doing in fairly profound ways.
Scott, it almost seems to me that your boxer is almost the opposite.
Absolutely. I was going to say exactly that. I said what Ann was saying in terms of a transformation of this like technological world is just not going to feature for him. And, you know, it's interesting because, for him, this pandemic has just been one other factor in his life. In fact, even when he got deported from Iran back to Afghanistan, of course, he was deported because of the pandemic. And you'll remember that, Iran was one of the earliest countries to really have a very serious problem. So he was very attuned to the dangers. The first time he went back to his gym, he went in wearing a mask. Nobody else was wearing a mask. And remember, this is like a small place. These guys are like, pounding on each other, sweating a lot. It's just, the kind of, sour scented place you'd expect in a gym that's not cleaned often enough, like many gyms. And anyway, so for him, he was just, everyone was laughing. He said, "Why are you wearing a mask?" He said, "Well, because of the pandemic." And they're like, "Oh, don't worry, there's no pandemic here. Like that's not an issue." So something that has totally changed and transformed his life. Now, of course, he doesn't wear, he doesn't wear a mask, but he's much more, kind of fearful of it than a lot of his friends. And they know, and of course, he knows people who have passed away because of this, and everything else. But again, he's not going to be one whose life has changed for technological reasons. It's going to be the kind of thing that, because this has prevented him and who knows how many more, for example, from going to Europe and therefore being forced to make a life for themselves in Afghanistan. But again, even that is just one single data point, because now, just since he's been back, there's been such a surge of violence, and now there are many more people leaving again, which is, kind of part of the overall Taliban plan with these targeted assassinations. So, he's just swept up in so many other factors, and the pandemic is really, is really featuring as just one. So, but definitely worth checking out 5 years from now and 10 years from now, and he's got an Olympic medal scotch taped up to his wall.
Wow. Sophie, do we have one more question?
We do. How did reporting these stories impact your own perception of the pandemic?
Anyone want to start?
Sorry, I would.
Ann.
I think for me, it gave me a more fine-grained insight into, again, just how effective China had been in containing it and quashing it, because you hear things, you hear the data. I think that there was some skepticism at different points as to whether or not the rates of infection and deaths in China were accurate. But talking to someone who lives there and is going out on weekends with her friends to crowded shopping streets in Beijing and restaurants, it really lets you know, yes, this is real. This could not be happening had this not been turned around as drastically as it was. So I think that was that did shape my view. I mean, there are other countries, obviously Taiwan has done an absolutely extraordinary job, but they've only had there's an island with more than 20 million people. They've had 900 cases and 9 people have died. And I've recently been talking to some people there, and they are all adamant about wearing masks, adamant about protecting one another in a collective way. And so again, different countries have had different approaches, and therefore the pandemic is unfolding very, very differently. And so, yeah, it gave me, I think, a lot of concrete on the ground insights in that.
Ryan?
Yeah, I think, the same was largely true for me. And I think what was interesting in my case is, rather than reaching around the world to get that story of what the pandemic looked like from somewhere else, I was talking to somebody who lives 15 miles from where I live, but experienced the pandemic in a completely different way than I did. And so it was just a kind of way to get out of the silo that I, had been in and have been in for much of this year, being at my house, calling experts on African politics on Zoom and talking to them about kind of big picture stories about what's going on the continent, you know, to really get it on the person-to-person level. I mean, it's the kind of thing I became a reporter to do, you know, that sort of excuse to be nosy and to go into the lives of people who you might otherwise have no excuse to talk to. You know, why would a pregnant university student, 21-year-old living in Soweto, give me the time of day otherwise? But because I have this gift of being able to call her up and say, I'm a reporter, can I ask you some questions? Suddenly that opens the door to spending hours and hours getting to know somebody who's really fascinating and who taught me a lot about the country that I live in.
Well, I'm going to have to give the person whose idea this was the last word. And, you know, Scott, I wish I had that melodious voice of the BBC to say, in Elsa, Illinois, it is 9 o'clock. In Johannesburg, South Africa, it is 5 a.m. In London, United Kingdom, it is 3 a.m. And in Beijing, if Anne were there, it would be 11 in the morning. I want to thank you all. Mark, I want to thank the Monitor team for once again being so supportive of us, and to all of those in the Principia team for all the work that went into creating the 2 videos, to putting this together. Also to our friends, Martha Moffett, David Cook, and Abe McLaughlin for speaking so fondly about our friend George Moffett. So to all of you all over the world, thank you very much. I hope you enjoyed it, and may God bless you all. Good night or good morning, wherever you may be.